everybody. So we need to get back to the series we're trying to do, which is to talk about this idea of integral theory. And to clarify a few things, the reason why we're talking about this is because I think this theory has use, at least as a map, to be able to look at things very, very clearly and look at all the pieces of them without missing anything. The last video got some interesting comments, and one of the negative ones was that essentially that people who are very atheistic and have a very negative history with Christianity or other religions were very taken aback by the video. And that's understandable. The reason why I want to bring that up, though, is that, again, the video isn't trying to make a theological argument, right? The video previously was there for the purposes of looking at state experiences that seem somewhat uniform across all faiths and seem to also be things that are experienced by atheists. That is, these appear to be brain states or spiritual states or mental states, or whatever you damn well call them. And it seems like they seem to be pretty universal. As such, we want to talk about these as though they are something that appears to be there for people as a whole, not trying to assert that there's a particular theological bend to this or you must be a particular way, right? And by the way, I did see the comment above about making attached outros. Attached outro might not be a terrible idea. I'll think about that. Anywho, with that said, let's get into this. So the next thing we're going to be talking about, first let's bring up this. Right? Man, we've got a lot of racists in YouTube chat. Anywho, back to what I was doing. Let's focus. I'm going to stop paying attention to YouTube chat. You guys sadly, if you want to talk, actually talk, you do your thing. So the part we're going to be talking about tonight is up here. And these are, at least what Wilbur calls, quadrants. So we're going to be talking about these because I think they're really useful. Quadrants are best described as the four perspectives by which all disciplines arise. Let me say that again. Quadrants, as a map, exist as a way by which to take into consideration every aspect of reality, or as much as one possibly can. Okay? So, as you can see from this graphic, right here we have 4 quadrants titled upper left, upper right, lower left, and lower right. And I'll explain what these mean. The 4 perspectives that these are pointing at are I, we, it, and its. Now you're probably asking, why the fuck does this matter? The reason why this is important is that the argument that I'm going to make tonight is that by using just this very simple mapping system, you can think of this almost as a way to counter cognitive dissonance. By definition, you have the ability to look at things in a much more clearer way, whether this is in the midst of a trigger, whether this is in the midst of trying to figure out how to buy a house, whatever it might be, right? And so I'll explain how this works and what we're pointing at. So from this map's perspective, these 4 perspectives, these 4 disciplines are I, we, it, its, or subjective, objective, intersubjective, and interobjective. Okay? Each of these perspectives has within them different domains, and each of those domains has different ideals of validity. Does that make sense? Yes, this is going to be important because this is one that is a little bit interesting. It seems easy, but I want you to kind of take this on consideration. So the subjective quadrant focuses on thoughts, emotions, memories, states of mind, perceptions, and immediate sensations. It's the subjective experience of being, right? This is an ontological claim. There's a way in which, from a subjective perspective, there is a way in which there is validity to your subjective experience as a whole. So the reason why we say trans people are valid is not just because of the objective science, we'll get to that in a minute, but because it appears that people have the subjective experience of being the gender they identify as, right? So we can look at trans people through this map, and I'll do that in a moment. The objective, as you probably guessed, is about the material body, the brain, visible and measurable behavior. This is basically science, right? This is the objective of it, the math. How much does the atom weigh? How much steel do we have there as far as we're considered in the metric system? It's the numbers of it. It's the real world meat of it, right? So if we look at, say, the behaviors of trans people, right, we know that there's brain differences, at least for the most part, there seems to be brain differences between, say, a trans woman and a cis man. Obviously, those are based on averages, but that's still interesting because it lends credence to the idea that the objective of reality and the subjective seem to coincide. Now, we want to be very careful because a lot of people who are coming from, and we'll talk about this more when we get to development, coming from a formal rational perspective will argue that all three of these reduce to the objective, that is, to a flat land scenario, as Wilbur would call it. Because from their perspective, from a formal rational perspective, the only thing that ever truly matters is the objective science of the thing. And we know for a fact that that's just not how things work. While the science absolutely matters, empirical reality matters, we also need to look more closely at all of these different domains because each of them has their own validity, and neither and none of them are reducible to one another. Okay? So, for example, with the trans experience, again, someone has the subjective experience of being the gender they are rather than the gender they were assigned. There seems to be differences in the brain, right? And objectively observed behaviors, because measurable behaviors are part of that quality. The reason why we do behaviors, our motivations, all that, that's part of the subjective. But the objective is we can look at kids who are socialized as their assigned gender and probably see some very stark differences between their childhood, their socialization, and what messages they received, and the socialization of, say, their cis counterparts, right? Put all questions or statements about this in the thing. This is kind of like that. Let me get to the point, and we'll get to it. But I do appreciate the enthusiasm. Next, we have the lower left quadrant, which is the we, the intersubjective, shared values, meanings, language, relationship, and cultural background. This is important because we have to differentiate the I from the we. Subjective experience is nothing more than simply and completely your own individual experience. But anyone who's been part of a group or a marriage or a friend we space or a spiritual community or whatever, know that those groups, those entities in their own way, are not so much an entity in and of themselves, but they exist more as a collective of different interactions, right? So While I may have my own values, groups also have their own values. Groups also have their own behaviors. There's shared meaning. Language, for example, is really an intersubjective phenomenon. You can also argue that there's frontal lobe development as far as the objective quadrant. You can also say subjectively it's a way to create and comment on an experience. Oh, hey, new person in chat. We should totally get rid of them. Apologize to anyone triggered for that. Trigger warning on transphobia. We're having a little bit of a raid on stupidity tonight. So does this make sense so far, right? And then we get to interobjective, the lower right. The interobjective focuses on systems, networks, technology, government, and natural environment, right? You can't really understand a forest by talking about just the objective, because the objective would look at a tree or the bark or the differences, the different molecular structures. And while you can look at something very closely and get a very in-depth interaction with it, thank you, Gayfesh. That's a really awesome approval. That's a really awesome thing. Thank you. Please protect people from these folks. So coming back to this, besides the frivolity, if you're looking at this, to understand a system, you need to understand the whole pieces of it, right? You ever heard the term understand the forest from the trees? That's what this is pointing at. When we're looking at the forest, we're looking at all of the animals, all of the different environmental features that go into how this functions. The rainfall, we're looking at the animals that live there, or we're talking about the general like topology. We're talking about all the things that go together to make that system of that forest work together. Well, you can look at any one thing, say a squirrel or a tree or whatnot. Those are individual it. We're looking at the it of it. This is a squirrel's body. We can look at a squirrel's brain. And while you could argue that the whole body is in by its nature a system, which is fairly true, we're looking at this more as the material form versus several different forms crashing into one another, right? So a good example of its would be Marx. Marx was great at this, pointing out the ways in which capitalism functions and the way in which capitalism sort of leads to certain outcomes and certain ways of behavior, right? Technology. Again, look at the internet we're on right now. This is a number of different individual things, right? Servers, my computer, my camera, then going to YouTube servers, which then there are processed, then sent to all of you. There's a number of things interacting. It's not just one thing. Right? And what's nice about this system is that, and this is what the point of this is that by using this model, right, we can actually get into an idea about how a thing functions. And this is one of the reasons why I think sometimes my views are confusing on the channel, because I tend to be a big fan of nuance. That is, I do not like simplicity. I do not really like when we don't take nuanced perspectives on things. Even the people on this channel that I've called out or talked about, I've been fair to. And I think nuance is incredibly good. I'm a big fan of metacognition, which we'll talk about on this channel at some point. I like the idea of thinking about our thoughts, the nature of thoughts, how they function, and the ways in which we sort of perceive things. You can break this system down in a really interesting way and look at it as, at some point, this is your perception on a day-to-day basis. You just pick and choose which perspective you're in at the moment. Sometimes your subjective reality is really fucking important, right? Sometimes the objective of the thing, right? The actual data points, those matter most. Sometimes the we space, what is the group's mode of discourse? What is the mores, the meanings, the values, etc.? And sometimes the systems are what matter. But what I'm trying to sort of convey to you is that, correct, these things actually don't exist without each other, just like M said. And I would even go one step further and say, not only do they not exist without each other, they're not, again, reducible to one another. We can't just say the forest is just its individual parts, because that loses the wholeness of it. You can't say a symphony is just one instrument playing. You need the whole thing. But that doesn't take out the effects and the benefits and the actual like contribution of the one instrument. Right? So an example of where this could be really meaningful. Let's look at trans people. So my name's Jess. I'm a trans woman, if you couldn't tell by all of the harassment. And by definition, my subjective experience is that I do not resonate, nor do I feel particularly comfortable in the assigned at birth gender I was given, which is I was assigned male at birth. I don't feel particularly comfortable in that. I never have. Right? And as such, yeah, you start to notice your biases, Saul. And actually, depending on what discipline you're trained into, like, for example, my discipline as a counselor focuses almost exclusively on the individual, right? The subjective experiences of the person and the objective measurable effects of objective measurable aspects of a person. Yeah. So doctors tend to focus more on the objective and then come to the subjective later, right? Kind of. So as a trans person, there's my subjective experience. I do not resonate with my assigned gender at birth. I am dissonant, in fact. Dissonant so much that by not living as my truth, not living as my gender, by definition, let's be clear, I experience gender dysphoria. Right? Now, if you looked at my brain, you may or may not see differences in gray or white matter density, but we know at an overall rate, there seems to be some differences there. We could probably even get into a question around the differences, say, what happened to me in utero? Were there differences in androgens? Were there differences in different hormones that I was experiencing? You can look at all this, but the thing is, neither of these reduce to one another. Then we can look at the intersubjective, right? The intersubjective is that trans people and the idea that your gender is fluid or can change, or in some ways is by its nature of being a social construct, is far more malleable than we give credit. That's actually something we all share at a developmental level, right? That's something that we in our discussions on this channel and in our Discord are coming from, because that's a shared value and a shared meaning. But there are individuals, due to their bigotry and the like, whose shared values and meanings come to some very sick conclusions. Namely, that certain people shouldn't exist, certain people should do terrible things to themselves, or just shouldn't be around because they experience their gender differently. As I've said before to clients, think about this. When you come out as trans, the only thing you're really doing is asking for a data change. Name, pronouns, and the way society reacts to you. You're not asking that much. In fact, you're asking hardly anything, right? But in reality, or at least from their perspective, you're actually going against shared values, meanings, understandings, relationships, because all of those things for the majority of the public, and we'll look at this when we talk more about development, are much more simplistic. So there's not just the experience of being trans, there's not just the objective aspects of being trans, like the effects of hormones on the body. There's also the intersubjective aspect of how we fit into our own, hey Thanagor, yeah, you just missed some fun. Intersubjective aspects of it, both within the trans community as well with, outside of it in the general public. Any questions, please put in the channel. I will go over them when we go into question and answer. And then there's the interobjective aspects. So if we're talking about being trans, what are the interobjective effects of being trans? Well, first we can talk about technology. The trans community has grown fairly large, right, exponentially, because in all honesty, there's some very real aspects of the world that have gotten better because technology has allowed us to connect, right? I mean, think about it. We have had a number of individuals find one another despite distance, despite things that would completely separate them in the history of mankind, and all of a sudden they connect. And that technology has allowed us to not only have a greater conversation with each other, supporting one another. Maddie put that in the questions in the integral quadrant questions channel. Make sure, mods, can you put that in the chat? I want to get to everyone's stuff. So technology has actually allowed us to be able to more effectively connect with one another, which, arguably speaking, has improved the subjective experience of being trans. It has allowed us to share more data and resources objectively, and it has given us a sense of community. Beyond just the average local group, could you really say there was a trans community in the larger group, nationwide sense, other than maybe the most, diehard activists? Sometimes you were the only person on your own. Nowadays, that's much more rare. So, does that make sense? Does this follow? We're looking at this because each of these perspectives are useful. And anytime we're talking about a particular topic, each of these perspectives probably should be just checked in with. We can look at separate, different discussions. We can talk about, you can look at this with kink at pride, your own personal subjective experience, the objective effects of what's actually happening, the intersubjective, both within the kink community as well as outside of it. You can also talk about the interobjective aspects of that. Hell, rainbow capitalism would fall under an interobjective effect that comes about because of an intersubjective one. Right? Right? That's how much these influence one another. And I would say that if you want to understand how this connects to states, it gets tricky, because Wilbur's argument is that development is very closely tied to these quadrants. We'll talk about that when we go over them. But what I would say is that if you're coming at it from a witness consciousness perspective, as we described within the last video, if you haven't seen it, go fucking watch it. This is actually the split that happens. A lot of people like to talk about the subjective and the objective, the subject and the object. But I would actually argue that this splits into 4 areas. There's your experience that splits out of it from the objective, and not just the material aspect of objective, but the objects arising in awareness, the things you're aware of. The intersubjective, the we space, the shared space. If you've ever been in a new relationship where both of you really dug each other, that's a very specific we space. Right? And interobjectively, we can talk about, with the trans example, how trans people are disproportionately negatively affected by economics. You can say the same thing with African Americans. Right? Because of an intersubjective bias towards or against African Americans because of racism, histories of Jim Crow, all that stuff, there is now interobjective negative outcomes on some levels. Right? So does this track for everyone? Does this make sense? Right? This is just a very simple map of this. Now, I do want to say this gets more complicated. And I'll show you how, though we're not going to cover it in this video. So this is something that I've looked into somewhat, and I don't feel super confident going over it right now, but I do think there's something to be discussed here. Let me see if I can find a good one that I like. Oh, there's a perfect one. So integral methodological pluralism is the idea that actually within each quadrant are 2 separate perspectives. And we'll cover this more in that video, but essentially they break down to the experience of phenomenon, that is phenomenology, versus structuralism, autopoiesis, right, the cognitive sciences versus the empiricism, hermeneutics versus ethnomethodology, social autopoiesis, and systems theory. Right? So we're getting into some big girl language right now. We're not covering this today, but I want to give you guys an idea of where we're going because some of this stuff is really helpful. But right now, I just want you to understand roughly how these different 4 perspectives work and give you an argument as to why they should all be considered. And the argument for them is this. If you want to have the most integrated and understanding view of any given situation, it is best to take as much information into consideration as possible. The only danger with the quadrant system, in my humble opinion, is that it easily turns into utilitarian calculus to the point of paralysis if you're not careful. So rather than going towards that point, we're just trying to, at a gentle level, attempt to understand this and get as much information as possible so long as it's valuable, right? We can take into consideration all sorts of things, but they may not be all that particularly useful. All right. So I'm going to finish this video here, and then as the stream goes on, we will cover the questions and answers. So for those who are seeing the VOD, I will see you in the next one. And do all the stuff, like, comment, subscribe. And if you want to donate to the channel, you can do so at streamlabs.com/transgirltherapist/tip. You can also donate at patreon.com, become a patron for as low as $3. A lot of good stuff on there. Not a lot of people have gone for the higher stuff, but there's some really good stuff there, especially a lot of helpful stuff. So check. Hey everybody. So real quick, wanted to let you know. Generally the format for these videos is supposed to be one video for discussing the topic and then one video for Q&A. Because quadrants is a relatively, at least at first glance, a relatively easy idea. We only had a couple questions, so I've just decided to make those one whole VOD. So I'm putting this in the middle to let you know that the video is not over yet, and we're moving into the couple questions we got and some of the discussion around those, okay? So please enjoy. You want to read that first one?
Yeah, so we've got from Ash, can quadrants be used to help an individual through an anxiety attack by separating what you're feeling from the physiological symptoms? For that matter, could it be used to help individuals through similar mental illness episodes?
So, in my opinion, yes. If you're able to be mindful enough during a panic attack or during some influx of mental illness or whatever, then what could happen is you could stop and you could differentiate what matters in that moment. So you're not probably going to be looking at the we space or the its. For those who forgot already, let me bring up this. Doop. You're probably not going to need to bring up the lower collective quadrants because we're talking about individual experience, but I would say that to some degree, what this would then cover is subjective. So what am I experiencing? What are the experiences? What are the sensations, right? So we're talking also about, if you're panicking, you might notice a lot of tightness in your muscles, or you might notice a lot of discomfort, or you might notice that your back hurts because it's very, rigid. That kind of stuff could be a big thing. The objective of that, though, could be is, what is your blood pressure, right? That's a numerically measurable thing. What is your temperature? What is, what are the different things happening to you in the moment? How does it affect your body, right? Not just the sensations, but measurable effects. For example, if you know certain things cause you to be more likely to have a panic attack, say, for example, dehydration, that's a thing, right? So absolutely, I think this could be helpful. Now, in the cases of other mental illnesses, what I would say is that in regards to essentially what's a good example? So, for example, with someone like myself who has borderline, one thing I might do is look at the panic I'm experiencing, the subjective experience of the borderline, right, the deep existential fear of abandonment, followed by what's actually happening? What is the actual objective reality of the situation? Right? So for example, if my partner went out and was hanging out with someone that I was insecure about, right? And I started having a whole bunch of random paranoid thoughts come up that something bad is going to happen. The objective could be is to look at the body and, like I said before, try to calm yourself down. This is actually how a lot of panic attack tools work. For example, deep breathing, square breathing, which we have a video for, as well as the tongue trick, right? So this is a fun one.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So real quick, if you ever want to help stem the bodily effects of an anxiety attack, this is what was taught to me by one of my professors. What you do is you take your tongue and you run it on the outside of your top teeth like so. One way, and then on the inside of your top teeth the other way. Right? So do that a few times and you'll notice something. You'll notice that your mouth will become wet. It'll become salivated, right? Full of saliva. And the reason for that is that when you're in a panic attack, when you're in fight or flight, your body tries to keep reserves and your mouth will go dry. It's actually a really regular thing to get dry mouth.
Kind of like all the liquid sucking kind of to the center.
Yeah. So the thing is that when you do that and you stimulate saliva, then what happens is the body goes, okay, we're not in danger. This has actually helped a number of people I've worked with, especially teens, out of a lot of panic attacks because you can sort of trick the body to stop doing the thing. It's not always perfect, but again, with a level of mindfulness, deep breathing, things like that, there's some fun things you can get out of that. I've had a lot of clients really appreciate that. In a similar way, like if you're just trying to duplicate, this is interesting and oddly effective, right? Well, and it's like, I'll give you another example. Trigger warning for self-harm. One of the things that I deal with a lot is clients who are dealing with self-harm. Sadly, a lot of people in the LGBT community deal with self-harm because of the way people like those at the raid treated us. The fact of the matter is that one of the things that you can do is, instead of demonizing or treating anyone like shit for some sort of self-harm or whatnot, I see a lot of parents get very, very panicked about it. It's not saying that this isn't an important thing, but it is saying that at least at some level, we need to come at this from a different angle. And so what I tend to do, and these are some of the ones that both me and another colleague of mine came up with, for me, it's the rubber band trick. If a kid is dealing with self-harm and just doesn't feel like they can stop that compulsion, and this goes for adults too, you get them a big bag of like Staples rubber bands, the nice thick ones that are about wrist size. And then if they have that urge, you let them snap the shit out of them, right? They just grab it, they go boop. Because the snap, well, not necessarily great to do self-harm in and of itself, doesn't break the skin, decreases any chance of there being any kind of infection, it doesn't leave scarring, and if their goal is to inflict some sort of harm on themselves, that can be really helpful, right? The idea that a colleague of mine came up with was, you get some of that ghost pepper hot sauce, or some of like the Carolina Reaper hot sauce, and you take a drop of that and then you put it on your tongue, just a drop, not anymore, on your tongue. We all know that capsaicin in high quantities causes the body to release endorphins. And a lot of people who are self-harming rely on those endorphins. The reason they cut is not only just yes, it can be counterproductive if used inappropriately or the person doesn't have that level of mindfulness. That is absolutely right, East Bay Street Medic. I agree. But yeah, the hot sauce trick is really interesting because essentially you can just keep a thing of hot sauce in your fucking purse. It's not that deep. And then you just put that stuff on your tongue. You're good to go. And it does all the stuff that would normally be effective. And again, no harm. Capsaicin hurts like a bitch, but it's probably not going to hurt you. Yeah, I am strongly against demonization of self-harm. So let's move back to the model. So let's go to the next question.
I was going to say, the example that I really had was PMDD. You might be able to help me a bit more with the language for integral.
Okay.
But PMDD being very much a lot of the physical qualities to it. So it can, when I'm in, PMDD is premenstrual dysphoria disorder. And one of the things that can cause is certain times of the month, particularly before my period starts. Hormones are really sensitive to certain hormones shifting. And so you can get really long lasting and intense moods. So something that might be like a minor irritation for like 5 minutes might still be really rough sensation in my body 4 hours later. And so I find that this framework to kind of switch between them and kind of identify the body things going on versus the emotional things can be really helpful to kind of tease out this, because sometimes my body's just reacting and it's not necessarily the same as what my brain's thinking about.
True, Vic.
So
yeah, I mean, like that's true. The body's like, hey, you have these good chemicals that can help, and then it's like, they're inaccessible, but it's up through these things, right?
What?
Like Vic said, evolution be like, let me release good chemicals because it doesn't make you feel as bad when you're hurt, and decide you shouldn't be taken into account for mental health. Like, true. So like, here's the thing though, is like basically, this is my personal ideal about those types of like compulsive behaviors, is that the purpose of self-harm is no different than someone trying to get a runner's high in some ways. I think what happens is when you break the skin, the body releases endorphins, and I think it's a way for the person to numb out. The nice thing about endorphins, they don't just affect physical pain, they affect mental pain. So if someone's dealing with a lot of distress and despair, boop, decreases it. Now, the problem with that is that becomes compulsive, problematic, and I'm not advocating for people to do that. What I'm advocating for is to be more mindful and more understanding about it. I think the the hot sauce trick and the rubber band trick are both really fucking effective for dealing with this in ways that if you can't control yourself, at least you have some tool, right?
The idea being, therapy is a process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Working on mental health is a process. So
let's get to the next question. We only have two.
That's true.
Which is fine. Quadrants are easy, so it's fine.
XHRIS-A? Something. There we go.
X-RIS. It looks like Chris, but yeah.
Yeah. Could you talk about how this model is perceived within and even without the mental health community? When was this model introduced? Is it widely used, well established, or controversial at all?
So, what I would say is this. We are not talking about a mental health model. It is a model that I use for mental health, but we're talking about it as a philosophical model. This model was created by Ken Wilber, who is a pretty smart guy, and it's used as a way by which to sort of look at everything. His goal, he actually has a book called A Brief History of Everything, and he has an entirely large book collection, if you feel like reading it, called Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality. Some of Wilber's later stuff is not my favorite, but it's stuff, right? It's a thing. But I would say that the people who are familiar with integral, because it's not super known, it used to be a much bigger thing about 10 years ago, and a lot of it faded off because a lot of the people that were engaged in it either were, one, trying to monetize it, they wouldn't look at their shit because Wilbur spoke so negatively about certain stages of development, which is also where a lot of like social justice stuff came out, which created a lot of fucking problems. Essentially, the problem was I've seen people use the integral model to become full-on communists, like following the model comes to the long-term outcome of being a communist, or they become like white nationalists. Not that the map does that to them, but if you follow it with your own, without taking into consideration your own cognitive biases, it'll just lead you to the same place you were going to go anyway, right? To the people that know about this, they do find it useful. There are people I know who know about this map, and it's not anything like super big. They just find it helpful. I find it particularly helpful with clients because sometimes clients, especially when in panic or in distress or dealing with things, sometimes if you're trying to like map out with them what they need to do, let's say they're dealing with parents who might kick them out because they're trans, for example, we can go through this and not call it this map, but we can simply say, okay, so how are you feeling? What's going on internally? Right? That's a subjective. Okay, what do you have? What is it you're dealing with specifically? What is the objective behavior or situation going on with your parents, right? Are they just yelling at you a whole bunch, or are they throwing punches? That kind of shit. You can ask the intersubjective. Do you feel safe? Do you feel like this is something? Do you feel like this interaction is caring and actually engaging? Right? I don't exactly know what you're referring to, T-Man. I must have missed the other thing. Yeah, Saul, it basically leads to it can lead to extremism because here's what I think happens. Any map misused can lead to dumb fucking takes, right?
Oh, you were just finishing up about
how
this was helpful to clients. Probably finish that and then get back to these guys.
But I think this tangent is useful, and I'm allowed to talk to you now. So
okay, that's fine.
The problem is that if you reduce certain quadrants, like for example, I've seen people who, because of their developmental biases and the way that they sort of use this for elitism, what they'll end up doing is this stuff that is how they feel and think are really important. Science is useful as it needs to be. And then they get into this problem where these things are completely wrong, or don't in some ways. They come at them from an entirely wrong angle because of their own biases or because they've already been radicalized, right? So systems gets almost entirely ignored by like extremists, radicals, white nationalism, and intersubjective spaces, again, they just reduce to tradition, right? And so there's a way in which this can be used to kind of make I would almost say like a butchered version of it, right? So, but yeah, that's kind of my thought there. As far as the larger mental health community, I would say most people aren't really aware of this. Integral was a really, really big thing back in the aughts. It was something that was going really well. A lot of people became coaches. A lot of people got stuff out of it. I found it really effective and helpful for working with people when I was just doing like on the side, like coaching stuff. As far as therapy, I use it as a back model. A lot of the stuff I do now with it is basically like just integral under the hood. I keep these things in mind, but they don't really affect my life all that much anymore, mostly because you sit with a map long enough, it just becomes the way you think. The same thing would be true with Buddhism for a long time, right? So like the issue is that when we look at the larger map, and I'll show you guys this again, when we look at the larger map, the problem is that you can take various parts of this and basically use it to your own ends. The biggest one here is this developmental system. If you're not careful with this, this can easily turn into a ranking or hierarchy, right? So for example, Wilbur had a lot of problems with this stage of development, which everyone color-coded. Wilbur, by the way, color-coded these stages of development for ease of conversation to green, or sensitive self, or what we'd call postmodernism, because he basically came to the conclusion that they had a lot of good ideas, but they didn't go anywhere with them. Essentially, they had a lot of ways of deconstructing the question, but not really coming to any answers. There's a truth in that to some degree, but he doesn't really give credit where credit's due. In some ways, yes, Zena is knitting. And in some ways, what he sort of argues is that this becomes aggressive, harmful, and abusive in its more unhealthy or its more shadowed ways. We'll talk about this more when we go to the developmental system. But basically, green, we can pretty much describe like canceling from, say, various communities on Twitter to be because of this. Lindsay Ellis is canceling Contras. These seem about right. So anyway, I'm gonna end this VOD here, and yeah, we'll just stitch this onto the other one, and we'll just call it one. That's fine. Shit happens.
I think Minerva had said, I don't have any questions yet, but I'm greatly enjoying this series. Thank you, Minerva. That's really cool.
MBTI and socionics to be a sort of advanced. Yeah, absolutely. And we can talk more about those. If there's things you want to know more about, we can definitely do those. But why don't we end this here, and we'll see you guys in the next one. We're going to end this VOD here. If you're still on the stream, please feel free to stay. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. You can also ring the bell if you want to be notified of our videos. If you want to help the channel, you can donate at streamlabs.com/transgirltherapist/tip. You also can become a patron at patreon.com/transgirltherapist. As low as $3, you can support our channel. Thanks for watching.